The Legion Hall glowed under tired neon, its windows fogged with breath and February cold. Pickup trucks filled the gravel lot, and the hum of small-town pride spilled through the double doors. Inside, laughter rolled over sheet cakes and folding chairs, Graham's voice carrying above it all like he owned the place. I parked at the far end, quilt folded on the passenger seat, a small envelope tucked beside it. The plan was simple drop, both with Paula at the check-in table, offer a quick birthday word, and head back to Aunt Ruth's before anyone noticed me. The door swung heavy as I stepped in. Paula's smile flickered, then settled into something apologetic. Before she could reach for the quilt, Graham cut across the room, his boots clicking against scuffed tile. He clapped a banker on the shoulder, nodded at the football coach, then planted himself between me and the table. "Only important people are invited," he said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. The grin on his face looked easy, but his eyes carried the sharp edge I'd known since childhood. "Not you." The words hit like a cold gust through my chest. I held the quilt tighter, the envelope pressing into my palm. Paula's hand hovered in midair, unsure if she should take them or step back. I drew a steady breath, the kind the army trained into me, and let my eyes trace the floor instead of his smirk. No fight, no scene that was the plan. I shifted the quilt under my arm and turned toward the exit, the sound of the band tuning up already swallowing me as the door loomed closer. That was when a hand caught my sleeve. The grip was firm, steady, nothing like Graham's swaggering gestures. I turned, and the first thing I saw was the flash of silver against dark blue, the bars, the ribbons, the weight of service that needed no introduction. General Caroline Hartley stood there, gloved hand still resting on my arm, eyes clear and calm as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying with no effort. "This way." It wasn't loud, but the room stilled. Chairs squeaked as people turned. Conversations cut mid-laugh. Whispers rose at the edges, the kind that travel faster than sound. Graham froze. His smirk slid just enough for me to see the crack. He hadn't expected anyone to notice, much less a 4-star general standing in full dress uniform under the buzzing Legion lights. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not pride exactly, but the weight of being seen when I hadn't asked for it. My instinct was to shake my head, retreat, slip back into the quiet I'd planned, but the general's hand stayed on my sleeve, her grip gentle but unyielding, like she was anchoring me against the undertow of my own hesitation. Paula at the check-in table straightened her glasses. The banker cleared his throat. Coach Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The small-town hierarchy Graham had built around himself wavered as eyes swung from him to me. I wanted to say, "This isn't necessary." I wanted to slip out into the cold air, back to the car, back to the quilt and envelope waiting for a quieter handoff, but the general had already started forward, and the space between us and the microphone stretched open like a runway. I could feel the draft of Graham's stare on the back of my neck as the general guided me toward the center of the hall. Walking beside General Hartley, my mind slipped backward, pulled by the familiar heat of Graham's stare. It was the same weight I'd felt in Athens, Ohio, long before uniforms and orders, back when Friday nights were lit by stadium lights and the town swarmed the bleachers. Graham was the star, the one in shoulder pads and a gleaming helmet, the quarterback who carried our family name across the loudspeakers. Winslow with the pass, Winslow with the win. Coaches clapped his back, teachers bent rules for him, and neighbors swore he was bound for something larger than Athens could hold. I stood at the edge of the field with medical tape and ice packs. Student trainer, they called it, though most people just saw me as helpful. When Graham scored, the crowd roared. When I wrapped a sprain, no one noticed unless it meant the star could play again. At home, our mother tried to level the scales in small ways. She slid me the better cut of pot roast when Graham wasn't looking, pressed her palm against mine after another of his celebrations, and whispered, "Do things right when nobody's clapping." She said it like a blessing, like a commandment, but Graham didn't see it that way. He carried his victories like armor, loud and polished, and he wanted me small enough to fit in the shadows they cast. If I raised my voice, he drowned it in laughter. If I did well in class, he called it luck. Over time, I learned silence. It was easier to swallow the sting than to invite another round of reminders that I wasn't the important Winslow. Those years stacked up, one unnoticed moment on another, until my life tilted toward leaving. I enlisted at 19 not just to serve but to breathe somewhere Graham's shadow couldn't follow. Yet here, in the Legion Hall decades later, I felt how deep those roots ran, how easily he still reached for the same weapon of dismissal. The general's hand steadied me, and I let my breath fall into rhythm with her stride as we moved closer to the waiting microphone. At 19, I boarded a bus out of Athens with a duffel bag and a contract signed behind the Kroger parking lot. Lackland Air Force Base in Texas greeted me with heat that clung to skin and the constant bark of cadence. I learned quickly that the world didn't care whose sister I was. It cared if I could run, carry weight, and keep my head steady when others lost theirs. Medical training pulled me in. We learned to stop bleeding with hands that shook, to read vital signs by instinct when monitors failed, and to build order out of chaos. The first time I knelt in the dust under rotors, my palms pressed against a young private's wound. I felt fear claw through me. But training took over. Breathe, check, act. My voice came out calm when nothing else inside me was. He lived, and that steadiness lodged itself in me like a compass. I wrote home in short, careful letters. Mom answered with recipes scribbled in the margins, news from the church, notes about the dog getting old. She never missed a chance to remind me you're doing the right thing, even if no one claps. Graham didn't write. When I came home on leave, he looked me over once and said, "You look scrawny." "You sure they don't just have you playing nurse?" That was his way shrinking me, so his own story stayed large. I stopped expecting anything different. It was during a late rotation in San Antonio when then Colonel Caroline Hartley first noticed me. She'd watched me steady a room full of trainees, pulling them back into rhythm when panic threatened to spread. Later, she found me by the water jugs and said, "You make people do the right thing in a way that feels like their idea." "Have you thought about a commission?" I told her money was tight, that I wasn't sure I was the type. She gave me a look that saw past excuses. That night, I lay awake realizing someone beyond Mom believed I was more than background. Her voice returned to me now as the general's hand guided me closer to the microphone. When the call came, I was halfway through a night shift in Germany. The Red Cross message was blunt. My mother's scans had come back wrong, and the doctors were already using words that hung heavy metastatic, aggressive, limited options. I signed the emergency leave paperwork with a hand that barely recognized my own name and boarded a plane home. The farmhouse smelled of lemon polish and broth when I walked in. Mom sat wrapped in a quilt, thinner than I remembered, but her smile lifted the room. "Don't hover," she warned, even as she reached for my hand. For weeks. I sat beside her, holding teacups she could no longer steady, reading psalms when her voice tired, measuring out medicines on the kitchen counter. Graham avoided the silence of those hours. Instead, he made himself louder in town hosting fish fries, talking about expansion plans for his business, telling anyone who'd listen how the Winslow name meant leadership. He stopped by the farmhouse, but always with an audience, as if grief could be managed with showmanship. One night, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, Mom pressed my fingers around hers. Her grip was weaker, but her eyes cut clear. "Don't let your brother make you small," she whispered. "Promise me." I nodded, even though I didn't know then how often I'd have to repeat those words back to myself. She passed on a Thursday morning with rain tapping the roof. Aunt Ruth and I at her side. The funeral filled the church, casseroles stacked high in the fellowship hall. People hugged me, murmured thanks for my service. But when Graham spoke, he steered every story back to himself, how he stayed strong, how he carried the family, how he kept Mom's pride alive. When someone asked about my work, he chuckled and said, "Alara's good at helping, but you know, the important stuff happens here at home." The words stung less for their meaning than for their familiarity. It was the same script he'd read since we were kids, just rewritten for a grieving audience. I stood there, hearing Mom's voice steady in memory, and felt a line draw itself sharp inside me. That line stayed as I packed my uniform again. Orders waiting. Duty pulling me forward. 2 weeks before Graham's party. I stood in a small auditorium at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Ohio flag and the stars and stripes standing stiff behind me. A handful of colleagues clapped as the orders were read promotion to Colonel 06. The pinning felt quiet, almost private, the kind of ceremony I preferred. No speeches, no cameras, just the weight of new rank and the steady grip of General Hartley's hand when she said, "You've earned every inch of this." I drove home to Athens with that moment folded deep inside me. Not for Graham, not for the town, but for myself and for Mom. Still, I couldn't ignore the message floating across social media: Winslow VIP celebration invitation only. Graham's name stamped across banners like a campaign. The timing wasn't lost on me. At Aunt Ruth's house, I pulled out the banker's box I'd packed for the trip. Inside lay the markers of a different kind of importance, a folded flag from a change of command, a redacted copy of my DD-214, a photograph of me pressing my hand against a young soldier's sternum while the medevac crew blurred in the background, and the challenge coin I'd carried since my first deployment. On top rested the scholarship paperwork in Mom's name, the seed for something she would have been proud of, a fund for local students from military families. My plan was simple. Slip the envelope with the paperwork and the gift card into Paula's hands at the VA clinic table, leave the quilt folded on the stack for auction, and be gone before the band finished its first song. No speeches, no announcements, no reason for Graham to twist it into his narrative. That was the plan I carried with me as I buttoned my blues that evening. The fabric stiff with starch and memory, the ribbons aligned by a transparent ruler only people like me kept. I told myself I was there for Mom, nothing more. But plans don't always survive contact with the world. And as I walked through the Legion doors, quilt tucked under my arm, I had no idea the quiet exit I'd mapped out would dissolve the moment a gloved hand found my sleeve. General Hartley's hand didn't release me until we reached the front of the hall. Mr. Tate, the Legion commander, stepped to the microphone, his gravel voice steadying the air. "Folks, let's hold a moment." Pastor Miller, never far from ceremony, moved closer, his Bible tucked under one arm as though even he felt the weight of what was about to unfold. General Hartley stood tall, silver stars catching the neon. She unfolded a single page and read with the calm cadence of someone who knew exactly how to command a room. By order of the United States Air Force Personnel Center, Colonel Alara Winslow is recognized for sustained superior performance in medical operations and leadership under pressure. Her words rolled across the tables, softening even the clatter of forks. A ripple moved through the crowd. I caught Paula's eyes. She had slipped in with the banker's box I'd left in my car. She set it on a small table by the bandstand, arranging the folded flag, the photo, the DD-214, and Mom's scholarship paperwork. It wasn't spectacle. It was evidence that I hadn't come empty-handed, that I had always intended to honor quietly. The general had only lifted the curtain. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Hartley turned to Graham. "Mr. Winslow, would you help place one eagle on your sister's shoulder?" His face flickered, first confusion, then resistance, and finally something pale that looked like fear. But with the whole town watching, he stepped forward. His hand trembled as he fixed the insignia in place, his smile stiff and hollow. For once, he had no line ready to turn me small. Applause broke cautiously, then steadier, filling the Legion Hall in a way I had never known in Athens. I stood straighter, not for Graham's sake, but for Mom's, for the woman who told me not to let him diminish me. The general gave a small nod, her eyes locking with mine as if to say the work was done, but as the crowd leaned in, I knew this reckoning was only the beginning. and the aftershock would come once the clapping faded. When the applause finally softened, people began to approach me one by one. Old veterans with caps pulled low pressed my hand. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years nodded, their eyes bright with something closer to respect than curiosity. Paula reached me last, her fingers warm around mine. "Feels like air returning," she whispered, her voice breaking. And for a moment, I thought of Mom standing beside her, nodding in agreement. I stood through the handshakes and the congratulations until the room shifted back into the rhythm of sheet cake and small talk. The band tested chords again, and the clink of coffee cups filled the silence left behind. I slipped out into the night air, the cold sharp against my skin, my body craving the quiet more than the attention. Graham followed, his boots scuffing the gravel. He carried the smile he wore when he wanted something, not when he was proud. "We should get a picture," he said. "Something for Facebook. Show folks we're good." I studied his face, the way his jaw tensed, the way his eyes darted as if already imagining how he'd caption it. "No," I said, steady. "Let it be what it was." His smile faltered. For a moment, I thought he might argue, press the point until it became another of his performances. Instead, he shifted his weight, muttered something about needing to check on the band, and turned back toward the hall. I let the cold sink deeper, the quiet steadier than the applause had been. For once, I didn't feel the urge to rescue him from embarrassment, to smooth over the edges for the sake of peace. The line I'd carried since Mom's last words held firm. I drew a breath and headed toward Aunt Ruth's porch light, already glowing in the distance, ready to tell her how the night had unfolded. Aunt Ruth was waiting on her porch when I came up the steps, her mug steaming in the February night. She listened without interrupting as I told her what had happened at the Legion, the silence, the general, Graham's forced smile. When I finished, she reached across the armrest and squeezed my hand. "Boundaries aren't walls," she said. "They're fences with gates you open on purpose. You get to decide who comes through." The next morning, I drove out to the cemetery. Frost clung to the grass, and the maple branches rattled in the wind. I knelt by Mom's headstone, brushed away the leaves, and set my challenge coin at the base. The metal looked small against the stone but steady, like it belonged there. "I did what you asked," I murmured. I didn't let him make me small. Gravel crunched behind me. Graham's truck door slammed, and a moment later he was standing awkwardly at the edge of the plot. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. Arms crossed. I was making a point. I rose and faced him. "Points make holes," I said. "You've been driving them into me for years." His eyes flickered, searching for the joke he usually leaned on, but none came. "I just thought he began." "You thought wrong." I cut in. No more staged photos. No more performances. Respect or distance. That's the choice. He shifted, jaw tight, but I didn't move to fill the silence or soften the edges. For once, I let him sit in the discomfort of his own words. I touched the stone again, then walked back toward my car, the cold air bracing and clear, carrying me forward into what waited next. 2 weeks later, I stood in Lancaster as the city crew set potted mums along the new Gold Star walkway. Families gathered beneath the maples, names carved into stone shining under the winter sun. General Hartley was there, steady as always. Her presence a reminder that service carries farther than hometown borders. She clasped my shoulder once, then moved down the line to speak with the mothers and fathers who carried heavier burdens than mine. The next Friday night, the stadium lights flickered on at Athens High. At halftime, the school board stepped forward, a plain folder in hand. They announced the first scholarship in Mom's name, small in dollar amount, but vast in what it meant, a recognition that quiet lives can echo, that sacrifice doesn't need a stage to matter. The crowd clapped, and I pictured Mom in her kitchen, telling me again to do things right even when nobody claps. Driving back toward Dayton, The road stretched clean under a pale sky. The fields opened wide, empty now, but waiting for spring. I rolled the window down, the cold air filling my chest with something that felt freer than triumph. Importance wasn't Graham's guest list or the titles he flashed in town. Importance was steadiness, the long obedience to what is right, carried out without applause until the day someone finally notices. I tightened my grip on the wheel, the horizon straight ahead, knowing that the work would continue whether the world watched or not.